Okay, we now have Chris Blask talking about sharing. This is another one of those gaps that we have in our ecosystem, not just for SBOM, but for all supply chain data, which is we don't really have scalable ways of moving this stuff around. And so our working group is focused on how do we move SBOMs and other types of data around. Chris has been doing a great job as the co-lead on this group. So thank you, Chris. And I think we've got a small handheld mic for you if you want to.
That's okay. I will stand here and be good and be constrained by the podium. So SBOM sharing, I've got two slides I want to talk about what we're doing, and the rest of the time I have here, I'm going to try to draw you into the conversation. So SBOM sharing has been interesting listening to the other talks, from Benjamin, in the EU, including in tech documents. And that's a way of sharing, and that's come up a lot in our conversations. And he mentioned a stakeholder, market surveillance authorities, right? That's not a producer, it's not a consumer, it's another party that also needs to get this same data. And John and others have talked to this. So what the group is this. We're a group of people getting together trying to come up with, facilitate the exchanging and sharing of SBOMs from legitimate sources, to interested parties, whoever they are, in ways that are appropriate for the use cases. And we're building on things that are out there. All the work done by Alan and everybody else in the room, and from the Department of Commerce and NTIA and around the world, the tooling that's out there already, and existing implementations. Right? It's interesting inside the working group, this is really, really hard. All these issues, IP control comes up, everything associated with threat intelligence comes up. But it's being done today. People are sharing SBOMs through all sorts of methods. And we have challenges. And so the naming identity thing has been mentioned already. This is a complicated issue to get through because there are gopher holes everywhere. It's hard to get through the noon Eastern time Monday hour conversation in the working group without stopping to ponder, well, we can't do this until we solve naming. We can't do this until we solve identity. But it's being done already. So we're making progress. And we're at this spot right now. So we're working on a single framing document that's driving some conversation. And inside that, description, what are we trying to achieve? How can you put that in words? The mechanisms, both the tools and the manners with which this is being done now. Who are the stakeholders? Something I'll touch on in one of the slides coming up. And two sections. There seems to be sort of two schools of thought in this. Perhaps that SBOM sharing is between two parties. I produce software, I consume software. And certainly that's the majority of what's out there. And another view that there's all sorts of stakeholders. Could be anything. And Kate Stewart and I gave a talk recently at RSA, and used one of the slides from there just to talk about that. And again, try to drag you into this conversation. We all need to figure this out. And POCs, so proof of concepts. We just on the call 2 days ago, this week's call, said we're going to start gathering POCs. And we want to get existing methodologies. If you are sending SBOMs by fax, carrier pigeons, smoke signals, anything, how is that being done today? What works for you? In some of these, when Jennings was talking about the healthcare POC, when I first got involved with everybody here, that was underway, and the sharing was sort of why I came into all this. And in that first POC, in that phase one, there was a box folder. Now, obviously, that doesn't scale, but you take the best people in the world and you look at it at that stage in our evolution, and that's what you do. And I go around the speakers, different, John at Citibank has shared how they're sharing things internally. A lot of us are with organizations that are so large. The managing and reviewing, as John said, building and comparing dev systems with later code. These are two different organizations inside the same organization, but they have operational, structural, legal barriers to sharing information, even internally. And demonstration of the strengths and weaknesses of these, it wouldn't surprise me a great deal if some of the really simple things actually turn out to be hugely useful. Not that technical people overcomplicate things ever. But, and then looking at open source ways to do this, standardized ways to do this, proprietary. If you are any sort of vendor out there in the world and you're sharing SBOMs right now through your bespoke way, we want to capture that. We need to learn a lot of lessons at this point. So to give you an idea, it's because it sounds really simple, right? We're sharing SBOMs. We'll just send it. What are all the issues? Is it I produce and I consume, or is it more like this? And once we're sharing SBOMs, a couple of speakers have touched this, what am I doing with them? Am I putting them to use? Am I from procurement to operations, or as in this example, am I putting it together with IOCs and VEX across the supply chain? Every one of us is involved in this. And this one of Kate's slides, this is relatively newly published through the CISA kind of thing. And again, you have to understand where we are in time. I think 12 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, we didn't have this in our heads. An SBOM is something I produce when I compile and when I ship code. One of the speakers touched on this. I didn't take a note from that, but we're already seeing this. There's the SBOM I get, it doesn't match the hash because something was changed somewhere along the line. So there's all these different points in a software lifecycle where an SBOM or a representation of the content and composition of that code is produced, and they're used together in various ways. Stakeholders. I'm going to throw this one out there because this is a really hot topic right now. Are there 2 stakeholders? Is it I produce and I consume and that's it? Are there 3? Are there N? Is it perhaps everyone? I like to get all the way down. This is electric sector example, the Kate and I used in our RSA talk, but maybe the customers are stakeholders, because I'll tell you what, the laws will change. All of us, not just people in this room, everybody, citizens of countries, if your lights go out because this is exploited, software vulnerabilities in libraries got embedded, you don't have supply chain security, all the lights in LA go out, suddenly everyone in LA is a stakeholder. And they're going to be driving legislation, changing the way we do things. So this is the kind of thing that's sort of stuck in all our heads right now. And I have 2 slides, here to help you just, I'll leave this up here and sort of talk to them. So think about it, right? The integrators I'd love to hear, from integrators in the room. We're all sort of integrators. I see one of my favorite ones at the front table right there. So I'm taking things from vendor 1 to vendor 2. I'm now making a product out of that. How far back does this go down? Am I sharing that build SBOM down the path? How's that being compared with another SBOM, the deployed SBOM that's actually out in the field? How are these shared internally, externally? The Benjamin of the EU, noted that they're not requiring in the draft CRA that you make an SBOM publicly available, but perhaps requiring it to be shared in technical documentation, which may be effectively publicly available. There's a lot of neat little crooks and nannies in this entire issue. And something we can all be familiar with, someone managing a fix. You got a security vulnerability, what do? Where are the SBOMs in this path? How do I get one, have it work through, I think this is the one with procurement. I think procurement's been mentioned already. So I'm getting an SBOM as a purchasing decision tool. Does this supplier have the diligence to even know what's inside the thing they're selling me? They'll have one SBOM and then one part of one company. And then I get the build SBOM of the product I actually got. And then I deploy that. Where are all these pieces and how do they move about and how do they compare to each other? How do we actually use them? In all of these sort of contexts, right? And we've touched on some of these today, the ISACs. What are they called? Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, right? They have a 25-year path that looks a lot like this one, started by an executive order in the 1990s. It was expected we create 1, we created 27, and they're working through still to this day, as Charlie has touched on, how do we share threat intelligence and how do we tie that with this intelligence? So we're following together these multiple evolutionary paths. I think this topic really ties them together, SBOMs in general and the sharing thereof. So what we want to both get through this in reasonable time and get us back on, Art got us back on track. at least some time for conversation if we'd like to on this one. We'd like to we have a good group. There's about 50 people in the group. We keep showing up week to week. We're trying to figure all this stuff out. We'd like your involvement. You out there in the world, you in the room. If you are sharing SBOMs in any way, even if it feels kind of silly, we'd like to document that. What is going on? Get involved in a POC. There's a lot of them going on. A couple have been touched on already in healthcare and automotive. And we can, if you're not involved in a POC, if you're in a different ISAC, another information sharing group, now is a good time to put your hand up, get involved, and start going through the process and see what breaks. And creating content. This last bit, one of the things that is interesting across these working groups, I think we can all resonate with this one, where we are in time, that we have this lovely federal government in the United States here that puts a lot of resources into getting us all together, and we can have working groups that are very, very difficult, and we can produce useful documents very slowly. And we can get them out there eventually. But I'm looking around the room, and I think we're sort of an age cohort here. I have 20-something kids who communicate rapidly, and there's all sorts of content being created all the time. So in our working group, we've created this hashtag. We're encouraging people to make, it's hard to get your voice in 50 people in an hour-long call at all. And again, our deliverables end up being these long-term things. If you've got thoughts, you want to share them, create some content, create a reel. The great Ava Black at Microsoft had agreed to that. We created we did 5 clips of a few minutes each, and I don't know if they're out there yet. Really want to encourage people to communicate not just inside the groups, but outside. The public sector has a lot of great capabilities, a lot of great restrictions. It's like Aladdin, right? Anybody take a living space. We in the private sector can do all sorts of things because we want to. So that's the content I had, short of questions. We have good time left for questions today, or in this section, so.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'll start off with a familiar question, which is if folks want to join, where should they mark on their calendars until CISA gets them the calendar invite?
Noon Eastern time on Mondays, noon to 1 p.m.
And that group really, again, does cover the waterfront of mature companies that have portals that are already doing this, to SBOM vendors who are trying to figure out how to better serve their customers. So it's a fun group. Any questions in the room? And for those of you online, first, thank you for dealing with some of the complexities of Teams. We know that it hasn't been easy, and we appreciate the fact, again, how great is the SBOM community? Everyone's been sharing tips about, okay, if you go to this view, you'll get this. So again, that's really wonderful to see this. We know that Teams isn't awesome. It's the sort of thing that we can take straight to our supplier and say, hey, for our next event, we need you to do better. So we hear you, thank you. Any questions about sharing in the room that you want to share? There's mic here and a mic there. Go ahead. Yes, I'm going to ask that you go to the mics so that folks can see you and hear you.
And while you're getting there, shout out to Emily Coran, who's right. We need a SBOM verbal history project.
Has the SBOM sharing group done much in delivering the so what of an SBOM? Sometimes for your asset owners on an SBOM, it's just a lot of noise. So have they kind of worked through any of those potential issues?
Can you say it again? The so what?
Yeah. Bother? So when you look at an SBOM, whether it's SPDX or CDX, of course you can just email that, or there's a number of ways, carrier pigeon. But for your receiving end of those SBOMs, sometimes it's kind of hard to deliver a good so what message on an SBOM. Has the SBOM sharing group, done anything in that realm or in that space?
I don't really know how to answer the what.
Yeah, I think you'll hear in just an hour or so from the on-ramps and adoption group that has been doing exactly that, which is why and how do we get started. So yeah. And
I'll riff on that a little bit. The reason I got involved with this because of a project Mehdi Entazari, if you're out there in the world, and Unisys went down this path with attestation ecosystems a few years ago, right? And what we found is that all attestations, SBOMs are included, you mentioned a couple, are shared by every means of human communication whatsoever. Right, where there's drop folders, network drives, email. You know, I have not seen an SBOM faxed yet. I'm tempted to do it myself so every single thing has been done. So maybe that's okay. And I'm very clearly on the multi-party. There's lots of stakeholders in this. Maybe it's simple. So that's where we are right now. Maybe this is okay. Maybe sharing is really, really simple. It's going to be simple mechanisms. It's always one-to-one somehow, and we can use anything. Or maybe there's rat traps everywhere you look on that path. So, yes, question. Can you get the mic so people in the world can hear you?
This is Maulik Shah. I'm from ServiceNow, and I'm building a product on SBOM. And I think this is an elephant in the room problem for me. Like whenever I'm talking to customers, they're like, how am I going to get this? I have so many vendors. If it's not going to come automatically, who has time to make sure this is kept up to date and accurate? Because we update our software quite regularly. So unless there is an automated fashion, a common platform that all the vendor uses, this feels like a humongous task. So I do want to understand, like, are we as an industry, are we leaning towards a common solution that works, or that can be kind of a mandated by government? Hey, this is the process that everyone has to adhere to, because every vendors can say, I'm going to deliver through this portal, I will email, or I don't know. Is there, can you give me a little bit more on this? Because there's a lot of confusion. The customers, how am I going to get this information?
Well, of course, I can't speak for the U.S. federal government or any government, and none of us really know what regulations and mandates will come out. So this is all my opinion, but I don't think that really works. I think, Jonathan's in the UK at Citibank, and he gave CISA props for pushing all this. So maybe that will be a sort of ICE 9, instigate everybody adopting things. But this whole issue, supply chain, is just the internet writ large. It's like literally every organization on the face of the planet. And it's almost impossible. That chair, any objects, it's very, very hard to say, what jurisdiction, what regulatory policy may apply to it. So I think we need standardized stuff. And again, as co-lead of this group, I try to keep my biases out of it. I work for a company involved with the Linux Foundation. I have this, ecosystem involved. So there's caveats out there. Yes, I think we need a common infrastructure. I think it needs to be open source, standardized. I think the plumbing level of it, right? And one of the topics to touch on this one as well is IP control, right? And there's a couple of speakers have talked about it. We're seeing right now everything from some people say, we're going to put our SBOMs on our website, period, done. And to others, much like anybody familiar with the ISAC and the threat intelligence world, is, oh my God, if I let this out there, my competitors get everything, the bad guys get everything, and everything else. And I think what we find, one of the things we find going through this exercise is that IP control right now is done globally at big corporations and big governments by hope. We hope the people we hired read the contracts that we don't share with them and literally know exactly which pieces of intellectual property to share or not. So I think that what we end up with on the IP control issue is not just good SBOM sharing, but better IP control than we're used to.
And then one last thing is about the provenance. How do we make sure this SBOM is coming from the source and no one has changed anything in between? I think that's another point on sharing and making sure that you are taking the right SBOM and accurate SBOM to make sure things are timed properly.
Right. You take almost every sort of attack that we're used to in the internet writ large, right, and apply it to this. The man in the middle or whatnot. I've changed it before it gets there. How does that work? So I think it's forcing us to take a little more seriously some of the issues we've all been working on for all these years, because the consequences just continue to rise.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
We've
got a question. Yeah, come on up to Mike.
Thank you. Ethan Ron, Arista Networks. One thing I wanted to understand is, where is this working group, or if it's even within the purview of this working group, to combine multiple SBOMs from different parties? Arista makes switches. We would use a combination of open source software. Let's say that's SBOM Alpha. we would use some custom firmware from Intel, that's SBOM Bravo, and then we combine it into our own SBOM with our own stuff, SBOM Charlie. And there is a question about how do you make sure that we haven't been tampering with the other party's SBOMs, as well as combining everything into one thing that someone could use and someone else downstream might integrate our product into their own. Can you share where the working group is with that sort of situation?
Yeah, so this is still really early stages in this topic. I think it's one of the more emergent areas. Like I say, for the last number of years, we've just been, every time it comes up, we hack around it. We set up a box folder, we do some things, like just throw it there, because it gets really naughty. But I think the answer is yes, because if SBOMs are moving around, I would like to see this working group come up with guidelines and recommendations. So what you're saying is you're sharing a bunch of SBOMs from different places, you're deriving SBOMs from that and then sharing them on. So the mechanisms, whether it's you or Jonathan at Citibank just sharing things internally, or as little company, little utility, the mechanisms should be the same.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Also, I think one of the things the working group has done is sort of try to treat the SBOM as black box and then or opaque unit, and then focus on the sharing side. And we'll hear in just a little bit from some of the groups from tooling and implementation to talk about that. There is a question from our friends online.
Yes, Chris, you can hear me? Good.
Yep.
Question from Paige Heller online. How will we maintain SBOMs when they will be changing monthly, or perhaps a case where a 6-month-old SBOM could be deemed unreliable?
Right. It's both an example of a gopher hole, because it's not really specifically about sharing, but how do you get into sharing without addressing that, right? So I think the answer comes down to what the sharing architecture looks like, right? That it's, we get beyond, again, this is a very internet sort of thing. There are N parties involved, and it may not always be defined what the value of N is, right? So, and, things can change along the line. Again, just in this short morning, we've seen this already. Hashes may not match because of. So these are issues we need to keep cranking through. As one of the people to blame for this particular, partly responsible for this particular working group, kind of hoping a lot of that stuff gets solved in other groups, because it gets fractal.
All right, Chris, thank you so much. And
One more question?
we've got a quick question.
Yeah.
Very short. Thank you.
Very quick. Thanks, Chris. So from it seems like a lot of bottlenecks in exchanging is to actually having right contracts in place so that vendors can exchange. Is it a quick question?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, contract language. Personally, I think contract language is everything, right? If big customer says you will provide SBOMs, big supplier will, right? And in the healthcare POC, the contract language example that was shared in that group, I'll say it was awful for this purpose, but I think it's standard. And I think the actual policy implemented in paper in the contracts around cybersecurity are lax for various reasons. But if you build it in there, yeah, as a vendor, I'll tell you, we'll just comply. Contract language is everything. So with that, thank you.
Thank you so much. Just very quickly on the. Thank you, Chris. We're about to go into our break online. Have a cookie and some coffee. In person, we actually have cookies and coffee. So we'll do that. Just a quick note on the contract question, because I think that's a really fundamental piece, as Chris said. And we can also start working on the building blocks, right? We don't need to actually have the lawyers, because no self-respecting lawyer is going to listen to something that has been drafted by 50 engineers, but we can give them the raw ingredients to start in that direction. Okay, little break. We are reconvening at 10 minutes to the hour sharp. So we look forward to make a friend, have some caffeine, have some sugar and fat. We'll see you in a bit.